Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back for his second appearance on the podcast, my friend Scott Tinker. Scott, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Robert. Good to see you again, as always.
So, guests introduce themselves. So you have many hats. I'll just say I'll give you 60 seconds. Introduce yourself if you don't mind.
We academics aren't very secure. We need a lot of titles in order to feel secure. Look, my day job, I'm the state geologist at Texas and a professor at UT and director of the Bureau of Economic Geology, which is the oldest research unit at UT. Been around 113 years now. We do energy, environmental, and economic research all over the world. My night job, I started a not-for-profit, the Switch Energy Alliance. We make films, educational films in energy and short format, long format, museums, and a lot of things in high schools, et cetera, a lot of fun. And then like you, I babble around the country and sit on boards and things when people are silly enough to ask for my counsel.
and suddenly, I don't know about you, but it's been busy. There seemed like this energy thing, it's just not a fad anymore. I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
the phone is ringing.
Yes.
Too much.
So the reason, and you're also the chairman of the Switch Energy Alliance. And that's one of the main things we want to talk about today, about a new multi-part series you have coming out on PBS called Energy Switch. And I have to, full disclosure, this is a full conflict. I'm all tons of conflicts of interest here. I'm in one of the episodes of this Energy Switch multi-part series talking about renewables. So I've gotten my conflict of interest out of the way here. But tell me, you've done 2 documentaries, you've done a whole lot of other content. Why TV? Why now?
Yeah, it's interesting. Certain audiences that we try to reach, for sure, schools. So we have the Switch Classroom in K through 12 now. We got 7,000 teachers and 40,000 kids using that, and it's just starting to roll. But classrooms, K through 12 and college, really important. We try to reach the broader public. We have a museum film looping on the IMAX at Houston Museum of Science and in the Weiss Energy Hall now, and it's in Perot and other museums as well. So that's a public thing. But the one that you struggle to reach sometimes is this vague thing called the general public, which a term we all use. Well, who is that? And we want to reach that educated public, but perhaps not as well educated or knowledgeable about the energy scene, the real energy scene, not the black and white, clean and dirty, good and bad energy scene, the actual energy scene, which is complicated, solvable, but not simple. So PBS is a great audience for that. It's an educated listener and viewer, and we wanted to bring to them a format that seems to be very popular, the talk show format. But rather than me with one person, we have 2 guests on, and thank you for joining one of those. And those guests, they're educated, they're civil, they have great dialogue, but they don't agree on everything by design. Now, we don't go way out here in the hinterlands with things that don't follow physics or economics principles and laws. We stay within one sigma, if you will, around that, but have a good dialogue. And that's the intention of the Energy Switch. And I think we will have accomplished that. They look great. Really, as you know, we talk for 2.5 hours with each set of guests, and we whittle that down to about 24 minutes, half-hour episodes, including the intros and outros of content. So it's really meaty. I think people are going to really enjoy it.
So how many episodes altogether then?
We filmed 10, but a couple of them were so long-winded, Robert.
Now, you're not talking about me here, are you, Tinker?
That we'll probably have 12. We're going to split a couple into 2 episodes. I mean, they were really meaty. The conversation you had on renewables was a really meaty one. And our dialogue on hydrogen was pretty meaty too, and nuclear. These were very fascinating. So we'll probably end up with about 12 episodes in season 1, and we're already scoping out a season 2 for August.
Oh, no kidding. So, yeah. and the scheduled to begin May of 2022, sometime in that time frame.
Yeah.
But it depends on each PBS station about when they want to air these. So it's not, you can't say firmly for it's going to be national, but it'll be the local PBS stations that decide when they air them.
Yeah, KLRU in Austin has seen and agreed to run it. They know the producer director very well, Harry Lynch, my
Right.
partner in all things Switch.
Right.
Harry actually has a series on the national PBS satellite called Now Hear This on classical music. There's only 15 things on the national satellite for PBS, and he's one of those 15, known well. He feels this is going to be just as impactful as that, or perhaps even more in a different way. So that's the way it works, is one station runs something and then they push it out to national affiliates and they see it and say, that's really great. And so that's how it happens. We're hoping for that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Hey, would you mind, do you have a gain button or a gain dial on your mic? If you can just turn it down just a little bit, do you have a gain function there or not?
Yeah, it might. Is that better?
Just a hair lower. We can adjust this in post, but I just want to. So
let me try. Try one thing.
I think that's okay. So, the goal here is really just reaching broader audiences. And that was the whole genesis of Switch Energy Alliance. You started this your first documentary was 2012, right? This is year 10. Is that right?
Yeah, we released it in 12, filmed in 9 and 10, post in 11. As you know, these things take a while. So we've been at this, 13 years now. Formed the not-for-profit, Robert, when we made our second film. We had a lot of content out there, but I said to Harry, he was making a beautiful series on mental health at the time. And I said, boy, we left off half the world, those folks without much or any energy. So we made Switch On and did it again, 6 different countries for that film, and formed the 501c3 at that time.
So then it just brings us up to date then. So you had the first film was Switch On, and then the second one was?
First film was Switch.
Oh, the first was Switch and then Switch On. I know. I wrote a review of Switch On. I've forgotten now. That's 3 years ago, I guess, something like that.
We released it in early 20.
Oh, in 20. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So it's had, but a lot of several series we've got out there now on energy poverty, a 7-episode series, and a lot of primers and 101s, and over 300 films on our Switch On website of different lengths, and the Switch Energy Lab, which is 29 episodes of me in a goofy white lab coat and glasses doing energy experiments. That's used on campuses everywhere. How's a battery really work? We make a battery, and what's in frac fluid proportionally, what's it look like? So these questions that all the students have, we did a whole lab series on that, and it's incorporated into our Switch classroom, et cetera. Just a lot of rich content. I think the biggest compliment we get is people that say, and we don't know your politics, Tinker. Where are you? Where are you on all these things? What are you advocating for? What, aren't you an activist? And I say, no, we're nonpartisan. We're objective. I'm glad you don't know our politics. Biggest compliment you could pay us. We have them. Everybody has biases, but we're actually just trying to give you the pros and cons, the critical thinking of all these different things so we can begin to solve them. And I know you're big on that too. Let's look at the data, the science, the economics, the physics, and the public policy, and solve some of these things.
Right. Well, I know we talked about this, and it was in 2020 when you were on the podcast last. And so, what drives you? I mean, you've been, I imagine you're pretty fully employed by the university and as the state geologist, and this is a whole other sideline. Why do you care so much?
Yeah, I don't know, Robert. I just.
Oh, sure you do. Oh, come on now. Sure you do.
Oh, what drives me? My kids, and I'm about to have a grandkid next week, first grandson, and they're facing a world that is always interesting and has become recently publicly unstable. We've always known that, but it actually happened again recently in a modern set of societies. And part of the Russia-Ukraine is an energy story there. It's a big piece of that as well in Europe, et cetera. So I'm driven by education and knowledge and people being able to interact and work together, trying to be a little piece of a better world. We all are driven by that. Was in the private sector 20 or 17, 18 years and been here 23 now. I just think it's a nice place to be, to access governments and industry and academics and NGOs at the very highest levels. And I do that. I mean, back to the energy switch, our guest, one episode was on the Geopolitics. We had Ernie Moniz, former Secretary of Energy, and Dan Yergin on. And these are big thinkers. And
Right.
Dan's written wonderful books, and Ernie is a global thinker. Terrific conversation. We had Steve Koonin on, undersecretary under Obama, written a wonderful book called Unsettled with Mike Greenstone. And Michael's a climate economist at University of Chicago. They talked about the impacts of climate today in a really candid dialogue that doesn't seem to be allowed in some places. We had Ken Medlock from Bryce, a great friend for many years, and Deb Byers at Ernst & Young talking about investing in energy. This is neat dialogue. Where do the dollars flow and how does that matter? Julio Friedman, who was in the Obama DOE and at Columbia and now out in carbon, he calls himself the carbon wrangler, I think, or the hydrogen wrangler. He wore a Wrangler shirt. Was on with Steve Humberg, the chief scientist at EDF. They had a really interesting conversation about hydrogen. And not, do you believe in hydrogen or not? We don't even use believe words. Like, what is it? How would we do it? How do you constrain it and contain it? Is it economic? What's it used for? Why is it color coded? All sorts of things that people want to understand. Billy Pizer from Resources for the Future came on with Sasha Mackler, who's at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And they talked about, how do we actually pay for CO2 emissions? Not can we capture them, but who's going to pay for this?
Right.
And how's it done? So conversations like that on these different episodes, I think questions people want to hear, these are the top people. But they're civil. They don't agree on everything, but we have a rich dialogue, and that is so important. I imagine that's why you podcast, is to have rich dialogues with people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that rhymes with how I think about why I do the podcast. Well, I only have one hurdle. Do I think this person is interesting? And do I think, and if they have, a big following, well, that's a plus. But to me, it's more about, well, what would I learn here by talking to these people? In fact, I was at South by Southwest today, and I ran into a guy. Oh, where's his card? He just won an innovation award for a startup, and he's Sam Hatham, and he's got a new design for low-cost housing, and that can be rapidly assembled. And I thought, he's going to be on the podcast, right? Because I just thought, well, he's an interesting character, right? It's not energy and power, but it's innovation, and that's
Absolutely.
So
my cousin just took a job as kind of head of development for part of Habitat for Humanity. And the goal is to try to get affordable housing for working folks who live near cities and can't afford to live there anymore, like Austin, Texas.
Yes, absolutely.
And so if he can innovate that way and bring affordable housing that you can bring closer in, so the commutes aren't as long and the safety and risks of that, et cetera, well, terrific. That's energy.
Right.
It all wraps together. And that's why I'm so fascinated by it and have been my whole career.
Right. Well, and that rhymes with what I think about it as well, is that it's just, and I'm not, I didn't have you on the podcast to talk about me, but it's just that I'm age 61. I finally feel like I'm starting to understand it a little bit. Like I'm not an idiot about it anymore, but to be able to explain it in a way, I think to other people is incredibly important. And I think that this idea about dialogue is really interesting. Let me ask you about Koonin, because I just met him recently face to face. He's been on the podcast, but I think his story and the arc of where he's been in his career, to me, is compelling and just intriguing in a whole lot of ways. And for him to then be going against his own set, right? And when he was on the podcast, I talked to him about it. He's from New York. He's of Jewish heritage, right? A lifelong Democrat. And yet he feels like his own people, the people with whom he's associated politically his whole career, they're not part of his set anymore because he's come to a different view on climate change and then is now seen as the apostate, which is
Look, I've known Steve a very long time. Okay, we're close friends. And he went from, look, he may have told you, may not, he went to Caltech at 16.
Right.
He's always been a scientist. He was provost there in his late 30s. He's a brilliant guy, a physicist, National Academy adjacent. He was chief scientist at BP to help bring them into new energies. That's when I was on BP's science board for 7 years.
Right.
And we overlapped there with Ernie Moniz and others. I'm on Shell's science board now with Steve Chu and people, the same kind of deep thinking. So here comes Steve, and he goes to undersecretary role, first term Obama under Chu, and learns a lot of things. starts looking and seeing the policy, and then he comes out of that, and rather than going off into some roles, he goes off to New York and into the university and works with, Mayor Bloomberg at the time to see if he can wire up and monitor New York and learn some things. And along the way, Steve's getting more and more concerned that the impacts of climate change, not the physics of greenhouse gases, which we understand and what they do, but the impacts, the actual rate of sea level rise, the actual warming rates, the actual storm intensity, as well as right. Storm count, drought intensity, et cetera, Robert, that he's seeing the data. And I did this same exercise many years ago and gave a talk on it. Looking at the data, he says, well, the trends aren't what we're being told.
Right.
So I need to put this out there. And he's putting it out there, bold and brave in many ways. And I was, helped look at lots of things that Steve writes along the way. I admire him. I admire anyone who gets out there, regardless of the topic, and supports the scientific process of discovery, of questioning, of civil dialogue. Tell me why you think that. Show me the data. Right. Let's have a discussion. I don't have to be a climate modeler to understand some trends and things. And by the way, Steve was a brilliant physicist and a modeler. He did complex, multivariate, nonlinear modeling of things, right? Unlike many people. So I do respect his story. Mike Schellenberger is another guy, with his book Apocalypse Never. And there are other things out there like that. I don't agree with all of it, but that's the point. Right. It's Aristotle who said it's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. And shouldn't we be able to entertain these thoughts? We don't have to accept them. But boy, if we get to a point where we can't entertain thoughts and have civil dialogue, critical thinking, we've lost the thread.
Right.
That's why I do what I do. That's why you do what you do.
Well, and I think to me, it's, as you're saying that, the thing that comes into my head is that his sin, if we can put it in that term, is to buck alarmism. Right. That and that's the part that I see in the media coverage on the climate issue is, and Roger Pilkey Jr., who's been on the guest on the podcast as well now, I guess 3 times, pointing out, well, a lot of these models are based on the most extreme scenario, RCP 8.5, and that simply isn't going to happen. Right. And to believe that it is simply not true. And so the people who are willing to say, you're being too alarmist, they get the criticism and they get, held up for ridicule and not reviewed in the New York Times, right? Which was Kunin's point, was that, I said, these are your people, but he said, yeah, but I can't get it. They won't publish a review of my book in the Times. There's a news blackout, and it's something that I think is very concerning. And I'll get back to the thread here in just a moment, but just that the biggest media outlets in this country will not cover, for instance, land use conflicts about renewables. They just won't cover it, right? It's like that doesn't exist. No matter if it's in New York, in California, whatever, but there are certain subjects they won't touch because the orthodoxy around these issues has become so prevalent.
Right. And Pilkey is another one who's bold and courageous, I think.
And tenured. Tenured. Let's be clear. And tenured, which if you ask these guys who are in academia about why they're able to, I have tenure. I'm not going to, they can't fire me. And so
I'm tenured also, Robert.
I get it.
Chair professor, but you can still get canceled by your own, and it doesn't make your tenured life very comfortable.
Yeah.
Because you would like to interact with and engage with people. I think the thing that I felt when you said that, though, whatever level you want to go to, RCP level, at some point people say, well, shouldn't we buy insurance? And this gets kind of to an economics story to me. Well, okay, insurance, but how much insurance would I pay if I have $100 home? Would I pay $100 a year for insurance on a $100 home per year? Or would I pay 50 or 10 or maybe $1 for a $100 home?
Right.
So if I'm going to spend, now it's up to $250 trillion to address climate change. Using the insurance analogy, do I multiply that by 100? Is that the value of the impact of climate change?
Right.
250 trillion times 100? I don't think so. I think you could take trillions of dollars and invest them in so many adaptive strategies to help improve the lives of those with no energy. As you know, another big passion of mine is energy poverty. That's our second film, and access for all. You can invest in things that will allow us to continue as humans to thrive and adapt and reduce environmental impacts across the board. Emissions, to be sure, but also the land, the air, and the water that we value so much and kind of get left out of this thread. So that's the conversation and the dialogues that aren't happening, is what's the value of the cost of the investment? What will it return to us? And how should that be placed?
Right.
Is it mitigative or adaptive strategies, et cetera, on climate? What do those things do to the land, the air, and the water if we deploy one of my favorite topics too, like yours, low density energy? Václav Smil has led us all there to understand the difference in densities of things. And low density stuff, just energy, takes a lot more stuff.
Right.
to mine and manufacture, collect and dump, just a lot more stuff. And that has impacts on the land and the water that high density doesn't. So what are the trade-offs? And these are the conversations that aren't happening well enough at all yet, but they're starting to. And in Europe and Ukraine and others driving it.
And Energy Switch is aimed at trying to improve that
Absolutely.
The discussion. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we hope it ends up being a series of topical episodes, archival, because it's filmed. It's really high production quality. You were there.
I do.
4-camera shoot.
Yeah, right.
Great sound and lighting. We've got makeup on and post-production, color correction. These are very highly produced television episodes, but short format that you can reference. If you're out there talking to somebody and they say, well, I just don't know about hydrogen, you go watch that 24-minute episode on hydrogen, and it's a good primer 101 that gets into the meat. And that's what we hope they become, is archival reference points for various use.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you mentioned energy and environment. You recently did a TED Talk. Was that here in Austin? How many minutes did you have, and what was the topic?
Well, it's a TEDx, which UT students put on, but it's on the TED stage. It's a big deal. They spend all year. And boy, it was fun. They were quite nervous. I mean, it was funny. My spirit guide for the day was a young woman a student. She was really nervous, and I was kind of calming her down. She goes, "Aren't you nervous?" I said, "Well, I've done 1,000 of these. I'm excited, but but anyway, you go out on stage, and there were 1,000, 1,100, mostly students there in the big TED stage at the AT&T Center. Lots of different topics, eight TED Talks in the full day, and mine was the last of the morning. And I called it the Dual Challenge, and I spoke about energy and the environment and the complexities you and I have been discussing a little bit, but I did it this way. I started by saying, I had slides, as you know, I love animated slides. And this was funny. Ted said, "No, you can't animate these. We just want them static." I said, "Well, I'm not your guy." I gave up static slides 15 years ago.
Okay.
I tell my story through animation, and they said, "Okay, we can go with it." You get 15 minutes. If you go to 18, Ted will never run it. So that's your window. And I started by showing a little, clip art of my wife. I said, my wife has a food science degree, and she does. I said, so she knows what food is. So when I grab that bowl of ice cream at night, I have guilt. I said,
how much fat is in there, how many carbohydrates. Yeah, right.
It doesn't stop me.
Yeah,
but
right.
I have knowledge, burdened by knowledge. I said, so enter kale. I said, no, kale, I love kale salads and soups and a lot of nutrients and vitamins, but it's not very dense. I can't really eat enough kale in a day to get the kilocalories I need for my body. I have to supplement it. So enter cow, and showed a big steak. I said, I love steak too. It has protein and maybe some things that aren't so good. I could get enough calories in a day, but it might not be balanced. So I said, maybe it's team herbivore against team carnivore. I said, where are the omnivores of the world? And I put steak and kale that I just had literally the night before on a plate. I took a picture of it, steak and kale. And then we went into, well, you could have local solutions, a few cows and a local garden. I showed a guy I visited in Africa with a solar panel lifting water to farm his backyard. But we're too dense. People are. So we need dense solutions. And that's when the eyes started to get big. Dense cow, dense ag, and then showed agriculture, whether it's feeding our food, our livestock, or feeding ourselves directly, the pesticides, the herbicides, the soil depletion, the water and the runoff, the emissions, CO2 and methane, et cetera. So these really damage the environment in a big, big way. So I had a brilliant idea. I put the big circle with a slash. Let's end food. And that's when everybody goes, whoa. I smiled and put a smiley face. We're not going to end food. We got to clean it up. We always have to work to clean up the environmental impacts of food. And then we went into other forms of energy and made the analogies between low density, kale, solar, wind, high density, coal, nuclear, oil and gas, some of the challenges of those different things, some of the benefits from economic poverty, and start wrapping it back around towards we're not going to get rid of energy. We're not going to get rid of food.
And
we're not going to get rid of,
and we're not necessarily going to use less, right? Which is the other big claim, right?
It's growing still. All forms of energy in the world are still growing from coal on up. Not a single form of energy globally is decreasing yet. It is regionally, but not globally. So, and then I kind of showed my typical scale things, the scale challenge. What in this whole energy consumptive graph, where's solar and wind? It's this little slice after 15 years of hard work, and it's great. It's growing faster than any other form when you zoom in, but that's a rate.
Right.
That's not not
the absolute sum, right?
In exajoules or
right,
terawatt hours or barrels of oil equivalent. Pick your favorite, whatever.
Yeah,
it's not growing. It's just a little wedge, and this is when everybody began to kind of come in, and I showed the reality then of the ties to economic poverty and energy, access for all, environmental, and said, look, this shaming that's going on, it's destructive to conversation. Nobody owns the truth. We can just seek it. So we have to begin to think about then, it's not simple but solvable if we kind of start to play as one team, not right. Team solar and wind against team gas and nuclear. One team. They have different roles to play, for sure. And let's think about how we work together. And that's how I left it. It was fun.
So is it available now, or is it going to be out now? How soon will that be available?
They said end of April. They sent us things we have to sign and everything, and I haven't, so I'm probably the rate limiter here. They're probably waiting for me to get off my tush and
right.
respond to all the forms and releases and all that kind of stuff. But it should be April.
Gotcha. Yeah. And it'll be called The Dual Challenge is the title, right?
Yeah.
So that people can find it on the Google.
Yeah.
Well, so let's back up a little bit. So we've talked about Energy Switch and Switch Energy Alliance, and the station break here is my guest is Scott Tinker. He's the chairman of Switch Energy Alliance. You can find out more about him and all of the content, which is a massive amount of content now over a decade. They've been producing with his colleagues, with his colleague Harry Lynch. Switchon.org is the location for that. One of the things that I've been thinking about now since this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's all upsetting. I mean, it's just, terrible to watch the, people being killed, just the destruction. But it's also created a very clear marker, I think, in terms of time in energy history and modern energy history, that is. And I guess I'll ask the question this way. Is this going to be seen as something similar to the 1973 oil embargo? Is this going to be a turning point in terms of how policymakers, consumers look at energy security? How do you see this now? I'm asking you to forecast, but how important is this in terms of energy policy, both in Europe and around the world? How important will it be in retrospect?
Yeah. And it's a complex dialogue, and I'm there with you. I visited Kyiv in 1982. I'm a couple of years older than you, and after college, and went to Russia, Soviet Union, for 3 weeks. And one of the places we spent time was Ukraine. And it breaks my heart. It was a gorgeous city and very wonderful people. So what's going on there, I just was hoping we would never witness again in a modern society. Part of it is an energy story for sure. But, you can't get around that. We have brought it on ourselves in many ways. You and I and our guests on Energy Switch talked about it. What has Europe done? They're They have gone down an accelerated road toward low emissions energy at the source, solar and wind and batteries, but unreliable and intermittent. And so reliable energy is really, resilient energy is the goal of every leader in the world, is to get something resilient for its people.
Right.
And Europe chose otherwise. I think they began to believe the dialogue that it would be both resilient and cheaper, and it's neither. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't have a role in Europe. It does. Just like in Texas, we have a lot of wind in Texas and we're using it, but it can't be the dominant role, because there's just too much required to back up the intermittency that's expensive and it's regressive. So people on the ground in Europe, they're paying, I just was on the Zoom this morning with a good friend of mine in Norway, $20 a gallon for gasoline. People have quit driving to work.
$20 a gallon for gasoline?
For gasoline.
Wow.
And he said, because they have one, to charge my electric car on an equivalent mile basis is more.
In Norway?
Yes.
Wow.
And our neighbor who lives in Sweden, same thing in Scandinavia. So you're seeing this regressive impact of these choices. Now we can blame the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but this was long before that happened.
Right.
And a lot of energy scientists, if you will, us, have been saying, don't do that. Don't go that far, or particularly that fast, until you can make sure the systems are stable and there's good backup, we get a handle on the economics, et cetera. So the politics are very interesting around this. There are passionate people on all sides of the dialogue. You asked the question, what will this do? I don't know, but I think what it has done, I was at Sarah last week and was on one of the CO2 emissions and then spoke to a bunch of CEOs kind of privately. It's going to accelerate a dialogue. It's forcing us to have conversations about the reality of things, security, energy security, sooner than we would have had them. And that's, if there's a silver lining, that's a good thing to me. We're having these dialogues because Nord Stream 2, it just happened this morning. Somebody put a bill back on the table in the House to build the Keystone Pipeline.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Okay. Will it go or not? I don't know. And we should talk about the pros and cons of that in terms of the environment, security, et cetera. But it's accelerating dialogues, Robert, that's really important. And I think the dialogues are becoming real.
Well, see, that's what I think that's how I see it as well, is that it's really injected a new sense of energy realism into the system, right? That I've said it before, but when I testified before the Senate last November, I said, what is Europe doing? Over-investing in renewables, under-investing in hydrocarbons, closing baseload plants, and relying too heavily on imports. And I wasn't forecasting this disaster, but it was clear then. And it's been ongoing, as you say, for years, that Europe was driving itself into the ditch. And what I hope, and we'll talk about something else, but it's just that I hope this is a wake-up call for policymakers in the U.S. that we cannot follow this disastrous model, because the energy security implications are just, catastrophic. And I haven't looked at what the price of nat gas in the TTF trading hub in Holland is today, but I mean, it's been running at 10 to 14 times what it is here in the U.S.
Right. And it's going up here. But this leads to a very fascinating dialogue. Someone might say, if a third party came into our conversation right now, they might say, but climate is such an important existential crisis, the word is used, that we have to address it this way. And I don't argue with that one way or the other. I think the impacts are less than they're being told at the extreme. I think Steve Koonin did a nice job of describing some of that. But even if that's happening, you say, well, how do you afford to invest in the systems that can fix that? How does any global citizen, whether it's extremely impoverished in just barely emerging economies all the way up to the wealthy of us, how do we afford that? The nice part about secure energy is it often follows, by secure, I mean available, affordable, and reliable. So you build your economies. And it's the healthy economies that invest in cleaning it up.
Right.
Clean air maps of the world.
We have to get richer before we get cleaner, is another way to put it. Is that
If
fair?
you're going to scale. If
Right.
you're going to scale. And not necessarily atmospherically, if that's your only measure, CO2 or methane emissions is your only measure of environmental health. Well, you could say, well, a severely impoverished person doesn't emit much per capita. True. Great. Well, let's just keep them in severe poverty.
Right.
There's your solution. No, they're starting to come up, and that's a good thing. We all have to get to a level of economic health and wealth, and so we can begin to invest in the kinds of environmental systems, regulatory and policy,
Sure.
clean it up. Clean air map of the world, go look at it. Cleanest air, where it's rich. Dirtiest air, where it's poor. Soil quality, rich, poor.
Right.
Water, local water systems, cleaned up where it's rich, not where it's poor. These are 3 of the 4 pillars. And I've been in 60 countries. You just see it every single time. Severe environmental damage where it's poor.
Right.
They don't have the money. And that's where this dance between energy, the economy, and environment plays. I call it the waltz of the 3 E's and the radical middle where they overlap. It's really where we have to be playing in this conversation, so that this concept that we have to do all this for climate. Well, actually, Europe, look what's happening. They're starting to roll back their climate policies.
Right.
Because they no longer can afford them. And the same dialogue in the US. There's panic now. And we're the richest places in the world if we can't afford them.
Right. Well, and the rush back to coal. I mean, this is one of the other things that is so remarkable about all of this. It's what, I've stolen this idea from Roger Pilkey Jr., but it's the iron law of electricity, which is people, businesses, and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. And that's what we're seeing now with this rush back to coal. But let me get back to the idea about hydrocarbons in Europe, because you're a PhD geologist, your way around the oil and gas business. I've talked with several people since now the Russian invasion of Ukraine about Europe's reaction. And the U.S. oil and gas industry has been built up over more than a century, right? And so we have, as I say, the rigs, rednecks, and rights. We have this incredible system here in the United States that's been built up over decades that has fostered the growth of, in particular, the shale revolution. So the question is this: the Europeans are now suddenly getting a big dose of energy realism, and there's a lot of talk in the UK particularly about throwing away the ban on hydraulic fracturing, and in other countries in Europe as well. If Britain or France or Germany or some of these other countries, and France has apparently pretty good shale. There's clearly large, significant deposits, resource of shale gas in Britain. If they started to drill now, or if they said go today, how long would it be before, and the best case scenario, before they can get the rigs, the rednecks over there, that they could start producing significant quantities of gas for their own use? Yeah.
Maybe we should use rigs, roughnecks, and rights.
Well, I'm from Oklahoma, so I'm, rednecks, it's okay. These are my people. It's all right.
but it takes time. Any energy infrastructure takes time. So let's step back for a second. Now we can use California as an example. We don't even have to go to Europe. Energy infrastructure for the oil and gas sector is expensive and extensive. It takes a lot to produce the rigs, drill, move it on pipes, preferably, much safer than trains and trucks and boats and barges.
Right.
Although we don't seem to recognize that in this country anymore, but safer and more efficient on pipes. And then to refine it and move it again and then use it. There's just a tremendous amount of expensive infrastructure. It takes time to get it. Now, Europe has some, and California has plenty for oil and natural gas. They have some. They haven't been at it for a while in parts of Europe, but they're not starting from zero. Right. They have the regulatory schemes, and they've done it in the past. The nice thought is where you have conventional oil and gas, where we're producing conventional. That's from reservoirs that flow once you find them pretty readily. Well, those conventional reservoirs were charged by oil and gas from something, from the kitchen, the source rock. We'll call that shale. It's not always shale, but let's call it shale. Well, that source rock where you have conventional is mature. It's generating hydrocarbons. They're lighter than water. The subsurface is filled with water, so it floats up and gets trapped. So, guess what? The Middle East and Russia have tremendous source rocks, and they are quietly developing them internally to get ready for that next generation of them releasing their unconventional reservoirs onto the world. Europe has some as well. You've mentioned a few basins there that have generated, and they could develop those. Now, there's going to be some surface activity that people don't like, and that's fair. Drilling, hydraulic fracturing jobs in the shales, pipeline building and moving. There's infrastructure with wind turbines and solar panels. All energy has surface infrastructure. Now, the difference between oil and gas, because it's so dense, is once it's drilled, you put pretty small surface infrastructure to produce the gas. It's called a Christmas tree.
Right.
Or to pump the oil, a pump jack, if it needs that, and move it away. So that infrastructure is relatively limited once the reservoir has been discovered, but then it goes away. Unlike the wind or the sun,
right,
the oil gets produced and goes away. And you say, well, that's what renewable versus non-renewable. Fair, but here's the twist, okay? Yes, the oil and gas goes away and you have to go somewhere else to find it or get new technology to produce more. So in the oil and gas world, we leave a tremendous amount behind.
Right.
A lot. In shale, 95% behind so far. Not in a single well, but in a whole basin.
Uh-huh.
So there's a lot still to be produced. Same with oil. Got to go get it, new technology. But the concept that one is renewable, well, unfortunately, I wish it weren't so, but unfortunately, solar panels and wind turbine blades and batteries wear out too.
Right.
And when they do, we dump them in landfills. And I showed that in my TED Talk, pictures of that happening. We don't recycle and reuse much of it. 5% of the lithium ion batteries. The wind turbines are not recyclable yet. They're giant blades. They're inert. They're not toxic. Solar panels are toxic, And so guess what? We dump them, and then you have to mine and manufacture and do it again. This isn't renewable.
Right. So, but now, so I'm following you, but I want to bring you back to Europe now.
Yeah.
So I'm with you, right? This is
right.
Expensive and extensive, right? This network of this complex network that we've grown to, kind of take for granted in the U.S. Europe doesn't have a lot of that pipeline infrastructure. They don't have sand mines. They don't have the water pipelines. They don't, the things that the Permian Basin or the Bakken, area in North Dakota has. So,
yeah,
but
it's,
so
it's,
just,
it's not many years.
give me the why. Is it years then? If Britain said go now before they're going to get a modern rig over there with the people to run it and to really start producing, we're talking 2 years, 3 years, maybe.
We can do anything pretty quickly if there's agreement to it. So you could do
enough money, right?
And enough money, but what's the cost of the instability? So people are spending a lot of money right now on trying to fix instability and all its forms. So the investments are real, but the returns are real as well. We know there are source rocks there. So in a matter of years, a few years, you could do this. For example, the Marcellus is the biggest shale gas basin in the United States. Pennsylvania, West Virginia, overlaps into Ohio, the Utica in Ohio. It goes right, we can see geologically, right into New York, but it stops at the New York state line because New York doesn't allow fracking.
Right.
So the citizens who own the gas, we own our own resources here in the country, have been told you can't have your property. And there's been no eminent domain payments. There's been nothing. I'm surprised there hasn't been a class action lawsuit by the counties of New York who don't get to have their property. Right. But we could get shale gas going in New York in a year. It's all there. You just extend the infrastructure.
Because the infrastructure and the machinery, the personnel are immediately adjacent in Pennsylvania, so they could just move across the street effectively. But
right, but there's still some oil business in Europe. It's not great, so it's going to take a few years if they commit to it, and it won't last forever. So this shouldn't be Europe's permanent solution forever, but it sure would be a great complement to being held hostage over Russian gas.
Right.
Yeah, and so when you think about what makes energy secure or resilient, Robert, it's a combination of things. It's density. Is it affordable? Is it reliable? And can I get to it?
Right.
And that makes it pretty secure to you. Political risk is very high when companies and countries are thinking about where to go next. Companies have to face political risk as well. Look at what happened to Exxon as they've just pulled out of Russia. Right. And BP and Shell. These are billions of dollars they're leaving there. I'm proud of them, by the way, for doing that. But it's a massive political risk that's going to go to zero instantly. Right. Venezuela, et cetera. So I think you got to start to think about these things as a portfolio. Political leaders do, like food. I can't live on kale. I can't live on cow. We've got to have a portfolio of things that help make this secure and resilient to us. And oil and natural gas are in there. Wouldn't it be better to be pulling back to natural gas in Europe now instead of coal? I mean, coal's great, but it has particulates and SOx and NOx and mercury and CO2. Gas has none of those things except CO2. Right. You know, a little sulfur now and then, a little mercury, but it's so much better as a fuel and other things too. So that's where I think we got to begin to really talk to our political constituents and explain the importance of portfolios and resiliency and having different things in this mix, and the investments are worth it.
Well, let's follow up on that, because the source you have not yet mentioned, unless I somehow missed it, is nuclear.
Yeah.
I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. My line: if you're anti-nuclear and anti-CO2, you're pro-blackout. And I'm adamantly pro-blackout, anti-blackout. Yeah. But in Europe, I mean, President Macron has made positive noises about nuclear. But here in the U.S., I have to say, as adamantly pro-nuclear as I am, I see, though, President Biden did not use the word nuclear energy in his State of the Union address. No. And we seem to be just completely stuck. So yes, that's my long preface. The question is this. So what's your view on nuclear and where nuclear fits in that portfolio? Because you've laid out all the others pretty well, but haven't discussed nuclear at all. Yeah, it's an important piece of it globally. There's different reasons for it not succeeding. But if you look at China today, they are building nuclear reactors quickly. They will pass France in their nuclear generation soon, and then they'll pass the U.S. They have 40 planning or building 46. We have 2.
Correct.
Under construction.
And they have another 100 on their books.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so that passes us, and there's a reason for that. I hope India follows that. India has the same population effectively as China. They consume a third of the energy of China today. Mm-hmm. So per capita is a third. Right. Their land mass is 1/3 the U.S., only they have 4 times the people of the U.S. So, I mean, they're not there yet per capita energy or per capita wealth. As they start to grow, what an opportunity to go to dense energy, like nuclear, whether it be large reactors in part, and I'm talking fission, not fusion. Fusion is closer than it used to be from everything I've seen, but it's still
50 years away. 50 years ago when I was a kid, I'm hopeful, but still seems a long way off.
But you can have different scales of fission. Mm-hmm. And these are where, like NuScale, John Hopkins Company's NuScale, small modular reactors, 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt, 150 in communities and villages as always on stable energy, complementing other forms of energy. So I'm very bullish on it. I think it will happen, and is happening in places. I mean, look, communism is good for some things. Saying we're going to build a giant dam called Three Gorges and move 1 million people. We're going to, it's not good. It's effective. Let me put it that way.
Right. Yeah.
Let's build 50 nuclear reactors. You have a problem with that? Too bad. We're going to build them.
Right.
And so it's very effective and good for them in many ways, because China and India alone combined represent 1 out of every 3 people on the planet. Just those 2 countries.
Right.
And what they do matters tremendously. So you come back to the political U.S., it's tough. I mean, I was with Tom Fanning a few months back. In fact, I co-convened a nuclear conference in North Dakota, or in North Carolina, NC State.
And Fanning, just to be clear, is CEO of Southern Company, one of the biggest utilities in America.
Yes, and he spoke at dinner, and Lynn Good was there from speaking from Duke, et cetera.
And Southern, by the way, owns the majority of the plant Vogtle, where the 2 reactors are being built. So just to put that in context.
And way behind schedule and way over budget.
Massively
because of
so, yes.
all of the challenges in the United States around this.
Right.
Some of those challenges, a lot of them are passion and politics, not safety.
Right.
It's misplaced concerns over the safety of nuclear power. And on a kilowatt hour basis, as you well know, it's been the safest form of electricity generated and will continue to be.
Right.
It's particularly newer technologies because they're really inherently safe. And the fuel, the fission products that come from those are lower density now, lower volume, lower heat because they're reused.
Right.
They're just a lot good technologically. I worry very much the U.S. is going to fall behind in nuclear and already are. We're going to have to play catch up with the world who's going to go nuclear and dense, as you say, no emissions. So there's a lot good. Now, it can't solve everything. Sometimes you need intense heat and electricity doesn't provide it.
Right.
You have to burn things to get some really intense heat, thousands of degrees. So molecules matter still in different ways, but nuclear has a big role to play in this mix. And unfortunately, we're seeing it play out differentially globally. And the countries who are embracing it, they need to, so it's not unfortunate for them. But I would wish that Europe, look, back to our early geology days, the Ring of Fire, circum-Pacific, is where plates are colliding and converging, and there are earthquakes and tsunamis. Unfortunately, Japan and Korea and New Zealand aren't the best places geologically for nuclear. They're volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis. It's not the most stable Earth.
Right.
Germany is. Germany's fine. So ending nuclear in Germany, pretty misplaced. And we saw what happened.
It is remarkable that they still are going forward with closing the remaining reactors at the end of this year. I mean, it's inexplicable to me. But let me jump back to importing electricity, some of which is from nuclear. Right.
It's the California model
from France.
Send us all our stuff and we'll be green. It
right.
just doesn't work.
And rely even more heavily on gas from Russia. But it seems to me, and I'll just add one thing on the nuclear part, which is now. It is remarkable, and I'm that the U.S. and the other countries have rallied in a very clear and almost unanimous reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so this financial isolation of Russia is going to continue, even if the war ends tomorrow. That's not going to stop anytime soon. I think this isolation, but it's key in terms of the nuclear part. I'll just make this quick point, which is that Rosatom, the Russian national champion, this has been one of the most effective companies at expanding the use of nuclear into other countries. And so if Rosatom is now taken out of the global nuclear sector, well, it leaves a big void. And who's going to fill that void? And I wish it were companies from the U.S., but I would say we lack that kind of industrial policy and political backing that would make something like that happen, right? I mean,
yeah.
And
so
I
tend to agree.
I'll ask the question. So, how my view is, or how much political support would the U.S. Nuclear sector need to really make something like that happen? And is it plausible to think that it could?
Yeah. What's happening with these small modular companies is they are going abroad.
Right.
They are taking patented technology and taking it abroad, Romania and the island nations and other places, Robert, and they're getting traction. They are going to build, serial number 1, 2, 3, and 4 plants there and start to bring the technology up as a local distributed. Think about it. You can put a reactor in a village in Kenya, and it doesn't need much else. Generate electricity for the village.
Right.
And so it has a lot of the advantages, the distributed advantages that many people have been promoting for other kinds of electricity, but dense and stable and affordable once built. So I think we're going to see U.S. technology being deployed in other countries in the world first, and then hopefully it starts to come back.
I see what you're saying. So
And-
it has to go offshore before it can come back, maybe.
onshore, which is
Yeah.
odd.
Yeah. Well, I can see why that, the plausibility of that. But I also know, well, a few weeks ago we had Simon Irish on the podcast, and he was from Terrestrial Energy, and they domiciled in Canada because they just didn't see a pathway for licensing here in the U.S. So we've been talking now, Scott, for about an hour, and I like to keep the podcasts about that length. So what books are you reading these days? These are questions I ask all of my guests about. What you have you're busy with a lot of different things, but you have a big shelf of books in the background there. What books are right at the top of the pile these days?
Yeah. I'm reading one called The Storm Before the Calm, which is interesting. And
what is that about?
It's talking about the evolution of the United States and starting to go global a little bit. And these big super cycles, about 80-year super cycles and embedded in those some other economic cycles, and how we're compositing right now in the 20s. He's saying it's going to be kind of rough, but we'll come out of that healthier, just like we did after the Civil War and out of the 1770s and 1780s and 1860s and da-da-da-da. So it's kind of a neat look at some of the trends that drive change. The Storm Before the Calm. I just got Mark.
Who's the author? Do you know the name of that?
Oh boy, I'm trying to think.
No, that's fine.
Greenstone or something like that. But
okay,
I got Mark Mill's new book on the cloud. Mark has written a pretty interesting book. I just started into it on the cloud and how it's changing our lives, and he's very optimistic about the 2020s. So I had to have some of each. I just finished up a couple other books. I tend to read a lot of nonfiction, unfortunately. I like whatever. Get stuck in nonfiction. Somebody sent me one called Wolfberry. So it was written around discovering the wolfberry out in West Texas and then leading into the shale oil revolution out in West Texas. Yeah, kind of neat. And they had quoted me in there, so he sent me a free copy, and I read it.
Well, look at the index to see where your name is, and read that page. Hey, there I am.
It didn't even have an index.
the wolfberry. Well, so that's the Wolf Camp sprayberry. The wolf. This is the formation in the Delaware Basin in the Permian. Am I right?
Yeah, okay. And what made this company work is that they drilled vertical wells and fracked them and was able to make quite a play of it. They didn't go horizontal until later. Others led that, but in the vertical wolfberry, so not Wolf Camp itself, but in part of this kind of silica-rich tight formation, they were able to start producing things ahead of others, and they got a nice acreage position in there.
And what was that company?
It was several of them. But yeah. Well, so last question, and again, my guest is Scott Tinker. He's the chairman of the Switch Energy Alliance. We've been talking about his new multi-part series, which is going to be on PBS stations, and full conflict of interest disclosure. I'm in one of the episodes, and that series is called Energy Switch, and it should be on KLRU in Austin, at least beginning in May. Scott, what gives you hope? Well, again, my kids and young people. I love interacting with them. I get hopeful when we're able to see the lights come on and think about complex things. And I know they'll be able to solve them. And this is global. We have 25 nations on permanent staff here at the Bureau, on permanent staff, another 25 nations of students and postdocs. They go back as emissaries. So I just see the lights come on when you start to critically think about things, and then I know they'll be solved. But you have to, as I said in my Senate testimony, there's a difference between completely factual and factually complete. And a lot of completely factual things out there, but they're not factually complete. We're not looking at the whole story. A lot of those in energy, and these young people start to see the factually complete things, and then they're very smart, and so they'll start to begin to address them and solve them. So that gives me a lot of hope, Robert.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop then, because sometimes, well, it's easy to be pessimistic, and but I put faith in what the late Molly Ivins said. I'm optimistic to the point of idiocy. So that's where I hang my hat on that statement. So Scott, thanks a million for being back on the Power Hungry podcast. And thanks for including me at Energy Switch. This is the conflict of interest declaration that it's my podcast. What the hell? I can do whatever I want.
That's right. No, it's always good to visit with you. I love listening and hearing your experiences too. Thanks for what you do.
Well, glad to do it. So thanks, Scott. Thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.